So here's a little fun fact. What a coincidence that this news came out right after my latest video. Turns out Crunchyroll is gonna purge some of the anime listed there. And after looking at the list, it's pretty wild the stuff we're gonna lose there. I mean, when I saw that Girls on Panzer, Umaru-chan, Is the Order of Rabbit, Chunibyo, No Game No Life, Nanon Biori, School Life, and fucking Watamote was leaving, it really made me think, man, this really is the end of an era. Now, like always, this is due to licensing reasons, and from what I understand, a lot of these might end up getting transferred to this streaming service called HiDive. I came very close to kickstart a subscription with them, but you know, eventually I stopped and realized, you know what, fuck it, I'm not gonna waste any more of my money with these stupid streaming services. At this point, I would rather pay for the piece of plastic. Which is exactly what I did. I just got a Blu-ray for season 1 of Is the Order of Rabbit. And you know what this means? I can do whatever I want with it. I don't have to worry about asinine licensing changes. You can't touch this disc, HiDive. It's mine. I can piss on it if I feel like it. Anyway, speaking of discs, I mentioned that I ordered the HD collection of Yakuza 1 and 2. Now, to be real with you, I wasn't too terribly excited for this game's arrival, and the reason for why I wasn't was because I knew I was going to run into one major problem. You see, a little after I ordered this game, I actually found a ROM online of this HD collection. I did because I was getting tired of waiting and I decided to have access to it a bit earlier. But when I tried to test it on RPCS 3, it wasn't booting up properly. It would let me go to the game selection menu, but when I tried to open one of them, RPCS 3 would just crash. A part of me was hoping that perhaps it was an issue with the ROM folder since the game seems to be labeled as playable. Hell, I even downloaded older builds just to see if the game would load, but it just didn't. And honestly, I kind of knew from the very beginning that I was likely going to run into the exact same problem even if I ported the game directly from the original disc. And I was right. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, but what's causing this? Well, your guesses are as good as mine, but one thing I can tell is that this seems to be caused by the game's bootloader. You see, normally when you open a disc that has a collection of titles off of a native console, all you do is click the one game you want to play and then it will load it up directly as if it were a regular game. On RPCS 3, the same thing would happen, except we would also see a new bootloader window, and I believe there was some error in the communication of commands, and I think this seems to be specific with my computer because I even loaded the bloatware that is Windows 11 and I had no trouble loading up the game. But with Manjaro, hell, even in Arch, 1 out of 10 times it would boot up correctly, while the other 9 times it would just break the application. That's why for a while I kinda just came to grips with the idea that maybe I'll just have to stick with the PS2 version, even though I really wanted to emulate the PlayStation 3 version. And I also wanted to avoid using my PlayStation 3 console as much as possible, simply because using that device, especially for recording, would be kind of a headache to set it up. Plus, I can't just jam a PlayStation 3 to play games in 1080p, even if it's jailbroken. Now, don't worry, my fellow friends, if that were the end of the story, why would I even make this video? There is actually a very easy fix for this bug. So instead of taking the normie route of just opening the game through the listing on the main page, you see the little option called boot self/elf? This is how you'll do things from now on. Now, what you need to do is open the game's folders, head to user directory, and you'll need to choose between Ogre 1 and 2. These self files will allow you to pick either games without needing to go through the selection menu, and once you do that, everything will load fine. It won't crash anymore. Although granted, it might crash after you close the game. I mean, look, I love RPCS 3, but let's just say I would not bet my left nut and claim that it's a stable emulator. Now, one thing I will note about this game is that assuming that you're emulating this the quote-unquote correct way by dumping the game's files through the original disc, I should note that the only way to actually do this is by either doing it directly on a computer, which I don't think should be too hard to pull it off, but since I don't have a disk drive, what I ended up doing was extracting the folders through a jailbroken PlayStation 3. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that PlayStation 3s do not natively support NTFS USB drives. There are ways to get it running, but depending on how it's formatted and what custom firmware is on your PlayStation 3, it can be a bit annoying to get NTFS drives to work because I have to reformat some of my pens and then transfer the game through the root folder using something called PFS driver. The procedure is kind of brain dead, but it works. Although I mostly just use FAT32 USB drives, and while for the most part transferring files isn't much of an issue, some games will give a bit of extra trouble simply due to the fact that FAT32 USB drives will not allow you to transfer files larger than 4 gigs. It can transfer folders that are larger than 4 gigs as long as none of the files there reach that size. Now, since this game is 18 gigs of size, you can imagine that at least one of the files there is probably larger than 4 gigs. So in situations like these, it does help to have Multiman installed on the PlayStation 3 because Multiman will automatically split larger files in order to let it get transferred to the USB device. I've been using the ISO folder with the split files on the RPCS 3, and so far I haven't experienced any breakages, but I should note that it can happen. MGS4, for example, won't play at all if you run it with split files. So yeah, honestly, I don't care too much. If anything breaks, I'll just have to transfer the game through NTFS. But anyway, after I was able to get this running on RPCS 3, I can safely say that the wait was kinda worth it. Whether or not the money spent on it was worth it is a whole different story, since I could have just downloaded this off of the internet and played just fine. But hey, at least I can brag about owning the original Yakuza games. Even though technically speaking, they're not actually original, they're remasters. Now, another thing worth asking is whether or not the experience is better than emulating on a PlayStation 3 emulator. And I believe the answer to this may vary from person to person. I've upscaled both games to 1080p, and for the most part there isn't a major difference in visual quality. I would say the PlayStation 3 version might look a bit better because PCSX2 doesn't upscale the resolution with the same level of results as other emulators, and in the case of the Yakuza remasters, it does have a bigger advantage of running natively in 720p, which does give slight edge in the results. It is running at 30 frames and it does have this weird blur effect, but honestly, if I were to pick which of the two to play on, I think I would rather play the PlayStation 3 version. Not to mention PCSX2 and a lot of other emulators tend to have this thing where even if the computer you're running has better hardware than the original consoles, a lot of the performance issues present in the original hardware will still be reflected on the emulator. So for example, Yakuza 1 had this issue where whenever you loaded up a different area, and by area I mean like a different corner of the street because this game had fixed camera angles, it would actually take a slight second to load that exact area. This doesn't really happen on the remaster, which does make navigating the city a lot smoother. The only thing that would maybe make me consider playing on PCSX2 more is that RPCS 3 does have to compile shaders very constantly, and sometimes this can overwhelm the presentation to the point where in a few instances the textures might not load in time. Although this is a pretty minor issue, it's not even really game breaking, and it's also not something that's probably gonna happen the next time you load those exact levels, locations, or cutscenes. But overall, I have to say, I like the way they look. You know, over the years, I've seen some people requesting for a Kiwami 3, even though they've already released the remaster for the original game, which kind of defeats the point of re-releasing it. But regardless of that, I've never really agreed with this idea, and after playing the 2 original games, I agree even less. When you jam these games to 1080p, they look pretty nice, and they're mostly still playable. I mean, Yakuza 1 is definitely a bit more difficult to revisit because of how clunky it feels, but Yakuza 2? Fuck it, I'm gonna play this game. Hell, I'm gonna play both these games from now on because they're still good games despite how ancient they are. Yet some people still want Yakuza 3, a more recent game that's closer to the current meta, to be remade just because they don't like the way the AI behaves. I for one just hope that these 2 games don't break on me because I have no interest in playing them on a bare metal PlayStation 3 now that I've been enlightened by the Bible of emulation. But in the meantime, I'm gonna binge play the Yakuza games from start to finish and maybe eventually update my tier list. I mean, actually, I'm probably not gonna do that because I don't really care. Anyway, goodbye.